Welcome back to Code Your English, the channel where we explore not just the English language, but also the ideas and reflections that make us human. Today's episode opens with a phrase that might sound confusing, maybe even unsettling at first. Die before you die. What could that possibly mean? Take a second. Let it land. It sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? Like something out of a riddle or a line from an old poem. And in fact, it is. This phrase comes from ancient spiritual traditions, most famously from the 13th century Persian poet Rumi, who wrote, "Die before you die, so you do not die when you die." Deeply poetic and deeply mysterious. But here's the thing. This episode is not about death in the physical sense. It's not about fear or endings. It's actually about freedom. It's about letting go of the parts of ourselves that keep us stuck, small, reactive, or even asleep to our own lives. What we're talking about today is a kind of inner death, a conscious surrender of the masks we wear, the stories we cling to, and the identities we're often trapped inside without even realizing it. Think of it like this. Have you ever felt the need to reinvent yourself? To start over? Maybe after a breakup, a career shift, or even a quiet moment when you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize who you'd become? That moment, that urge, is the first whisper of dying before you die. It's the beginning of transformation. In Sufi mysticism, in Stoic philosophy, in Buddhism, and even modern psychology, there's a shared idea. If you can face your ego, your fears, your attachments, your mental patterns, now, while you're alive, you can experience a kind of rebirth, a second life, a clearer, lighter way of being. So, why does this matter? Because many of us, maybe even most of us, live on autopilot. We move through our days reacting instead of responding, chasing approval, repeating habits that feel familiar but not fulfilling. We carry identities like armor, the strong one, the successful one, the nice one. But at what cost? What do we lose when we're too afraid to let go of who we think we're supposed to be? This episode is an invitation. Not to physically die, of course, but to shed, to release, to question the roles and routines that have shaped you, and ask, are they still true? Are they still mine? As we go deeper, I'll be sharing reflections, stories, and questions that might challenge the way you see yourself, gently but honestly. And as always, I'll speak in a way that supports your language growth while connecting you to meaningful, introspective content. So, are you ready? Let's step into the unknown and begin the journey of dying before we die. The identity we wear. Who are you, really? So let's take the next step in this journey, a step inward. Because before we can talk about letting go, before we can even begin to die before we die, we have to understand what exactly it is that we're holding on to. Let me ask you something, and take your time with this. Who are you? Now, most people, when faced with that question, respond with the usual answers. I'm a teacher. I'm a father. I'm from Brazil. I'm an introvert. I'm a perfectionist. Maybe even, I'm the kind of person who always puts others first. And those answers are fine. They're familiar. They're socially acceptable. But if you look a little closer, you'll notice that most of those statements are not about who you are. They're about what you do, or where you come from, or how you've learned to behave over time. In other words, they're layers, roles, labels, descriptions you've picked up, sometimes consciously, but often without even realizing it. We all wear identities. Some are given to us early in life, by family, by culture, by school. Others we collect along the way, through our experiences, our careers, our relationships. We build a self-concept, a kind of internal story about who we are and what we stand for. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. In many ways, these identities help us feel stable in a world that can be overwhelming. They give us structure, a sense of belonging, a way to introduce ourselves at parties. But here's where it gets tricky. Over time, we often become attached to those roles. So attached, in fact, that we start to believe they're permanent or even absolute. We forget that they're just one version of us, shaped by a certain time, a certain environment, a certain set of expectations. Think about it. How often do we say things like, "I could never do that, it's just not me," or "I'm not the type of person who takes risks"? These aren't facts, they're beliefs. Beliefs we've internalized so deeply, we don't even question them anymore. And when we cling to those beliefs too tightly, identity becomes a kind of armor, something we use to protect ourselves from discomfort, uncertainty, or change. We hide behind our job titles. We play the role of the responsible one, or the quiet one, or the fixer. We learn to act in ways that match the image we've built, even if that image is outdated or no longer helpful. But here's the catch. The same armor that protects us also traps us. Because when we hold on too tightly to who we think we are, we close the door to who we might become. We limit our choices. We say no to opportunities that don't fit the brand. We stay in relationships or careers that no longer feel alive, simply because they match the identity we've constructed. So let me ask you again, with all of that in mind, who are you? Really? If you removed the labels, if you weren't defined by your job, your country, your relationship status, your personality type, what would be left? This is where the conversation gets deeper, because at the core of all this is the concept of the ego, not in the arrogant sense, but in the psychological sense. Ego, in this context, refers to the part of the mind that creates and maintains a sense of identity. It's the voice that says, "I am this, I'm not that. People like me don't do things like that." It's always comparing, defending, proving, trying to protect the self-image it has built over time. Now, ego isn't the enemy. It's actually doing its job, trying to keep you safe, trying to help you survive in a complex social world. But the problem arises when we mistake the ego for our true self. When we believe that our identity, this collection of roles, habits, preferences, and past experiences, is all that we are. The truth is, the self is much more fluid than we're often taught. You are not a fixed character in a rigid script. You're a dynamic being, constantly growing, shifting, adapting. And if we want to live with more freedom and authenticity, we need to stop clinging to identities that no longer serve us and start exploring what lies beneath them. I'm not saying this is easy. Letting go of an identity can feel like a small death. If you've always been the high achiever, who are you without the gold stars? If you've always been the caregiver, who are you when you finally put your own needs first? If you've built your entire self-worth around being the smart one or the strong one, what happens when life humbles you? But here's the good news. Something deeper always remains. Beneath the surface roles and stories is a quieter self. A self that's not trying to impress anyone, not trying to perform. A self that doesn't need validation, because it's already whole. And that's what dying before you die is really pointing to. It's not about destroying yourself, It's about releasing the illusions you've confused with your essence. It's about loosening your grip on the costume, so you can finally feel the air on your skin. So here's a question to carry with you. What parts of your identity feel natural, and what parts feel like performance? Take a moment. Be honest with yourself. Because in the next part of our journey, we'll talk about what it means to let go. Not to collapse or disappear, but to make space. Space for something more honest, more fluid, and more alive. Death of the ego. Not as grim as it sounds. So now that we've taken a closer look at the identities we wear, the roles we adopt, the stories we tell ourselves, let's go deeper into the idea at the heart of this episode. What does it really mean to die before you die? What is it that's supposed to die, exactly? Here's where we bring in the concept of the ego. And just to be clear, when I say ego, I don't mean arrogance or self-importance, the way it's sometimes used in casual conversation. I'm talking about something a little more subtle and a lot more universal. The ego, in this context, refers to the psychological structure, or mental identity, we build over time. It's made up of all the beliefs, fears, memories, and social conditioning that shape the way we see ourselves and the way we show up in the world. Now, here's the thing. The ego is not evil. It's not some villain living inside you. In fact, it serves an important function. It gives us a sense of continuity. It helps us navigate society. It protects us, emotionally, psychologically, from feeling unsafe, unseen, or out of control. You could say the ego is like a bodyguard. It stands in front of us, always on alert, always working to defend the version of us that it believes is acceptable or safe. But the problem is, that bodyguard can get very loud and very rigid. Over time, the ego starts to confuse safety with sameness. It tells us to stick to what we know, to repeat old patterns, to hold on to our image, even when that image becomes a cage. And that's where the suffering begins, when the ego is no longer serving us, but controlling us. So, when we talk about the death of the ego, we're not talking about wiping out your personality or losing your sense of self. We're talking about loosening your grip on the habits of mind that keep you stuck. It means stepping back from the automatic narratives, the internal stories that limit your growth and keep you living in fear or defensiveness. It's a kind of mental decluttering, a quiet shedding of the old assumptions you've outgrown. Let me give you a personal example. For most of my life, I carried a strong identity as the achiever. I was the person who got things done, the one who always delivered, always showed up early, always exceeded expectations. On the surface, it looked like a strength, and in many ways, it was. That achiever mindset helped me reach goals, build skills, and feel confident. But underneath, it was also deeply tied to fear. A fear of not being enough. A fear of being invisible if I didn't prove my worth through performance. So, I pushed. I worked longer hours than I needed to. I said yes to everything. I constantly evaluated my value based on output. And I didn't even realize I was doing it. That identity, the achiever, had become so intertwined with who I thought I was that I couldn't imagine existing without it. But then life, as it often does, brought me to a breaking point. I burned out. Physically, emotionally, mentally. I found myself exhausted, anxious, disconnected, and questioning everything. And in that discomfort, something began to shift. Slowly, quietly. I started to see the achiever not as my true self, but as a survival strategy. A role I had learned to play, not a permanent truth about who I was. Letting go of that identity wasn't easy. At first, it felt like a death, I felt exposed, uncertain, even a bit lost. But over time, I realized that what I was losing was not myself, but the pressure, the weight, of always having to be someone. And in that space, something softer, truer, and more grounded began to emerge. This, in essence, is the death of the ego. It's not a dramatic explosion. It's more like a gradual exhale, a quiet peeling away of mental habits and emotional armor. And what remains isn't a blank slate, but a deeper version of you. One that isn't performing or proving, but simply being. And here's where language really matters. When we say what no longer serves you, we're pointing to anything, a belief, a behavior, a mindset that may have once helped you survive, but now holds you back. It might be the story that says you always have to be strong, or the idea that you're not creative, or the habit of judging yourself for feeling too much. These are ego defenses. They're not signs of weakness, but signs of conditioning. And the good news is, they're not permanent. The ego is not set in stone. It's more like a costume you've worn for so long, you forgot it was a costume. And once you see it, you can choose, piece by piece, to let it go. So if you're listening to this and thinking, I've always been the peacekeeper, or I've always been the independent one, or I've never been the type to take risks, ask yourself, is that still true? Or is that just what I've gotten used to believing? Because when we talk about dying before you die, we're talking about dying to those fixed identities. We're talking about letting go of who you thought you had to be, so you can step into who you actually are. It's not grim. It's not morbid. In fact, it's liberating. Because when you stop clinging to the ego's narrow version of yourself, you make room for something wider. A life that feels more spacious, more alive, more aligned. So here's something to reflect on as we move forward. What identity are you still holding on to? Not because it feels true, but because it feels familiar. And if you were to set it down, just for a moment, who might you become? Quieting the inner noise. Let's slow down for a moment, not just in this episode, but in ourselves. Let's pause. Because before anything can truly shift, before we can let go, change direction, or even see ourselves clearly, we need to address something that most of us live with, but rarely notice directly. And that's the constant stream of thoughts running through our heads. We all have it, that inner voice. Sometimes it sounds like our own. Sometimes it sounds like a parent, a teacher, or some critical version of ourselves we picked up years ago. And it doesn't turn off, does it? It's like mental background noise, always narrating, judging, worrying, comparing. It tells you what to do, what not to do, what other people might be thinking. It replays arguments. It rehearses future conversations that may never happen. It loops on what-ifs. What if I fail? What if I said the wrong thing? What if I'm not good enough? This is what we often call mental chatter. And while it might seem harmless, just thoughts, right? Over time, that chatter begins to shape our experience of reality. It creates emotional tension, fuels anxiety, and keeps us trapped in patterns of self-doubt and overthinking. You might have heard expressions like, get in your own head, or go down a rabbit hole, both of which describe how quickly our thoughts can spiral, often without us even realizing it. Have you ever noticed how much energy it takes to keep thinking about the same problem without ever actually solving it? That's rumination. It's like chewing the same piece of gum over and over. It loses all flavor, but we just keep going. And we don't just ruminate about mistakes or regrets. We dwell on possibilities, We overthink decisions. We second-guess ourselves. We worry about how we're being perceived. It's exhausting. But because it feels normal, because everyone does it, we rarely step back and ask, is this actually helping me? Now, don't get me wrong. Thinking isn't the enemy. Our ability to think, to reflect, to plan, it's an extraordinary human gift. But when the mind becomes noisy, when it's constantly spinning without awareness, we lose contact with a deeper kind of intelligence. We lose presence. We miss what's happening right now. So what's the alternative? Do we try to stop thinking? Not exactly. You see, the goal isn't to silence the mind completely. That's nearly impossible. The goal is to observe it, to create a little space between you and your thoughts. Because when you observe your thoughts instead of automatically believing them or following them, you reclaim a sense of inner freedom. One of the most powerful questions you can ask yourself is this: when was the last time I just noticed my thoughts without reacting to them? You might be surprised by what you find when you try. Most people, maybe most of us, never actually watch the mind with curiosity. We're so identified with our thoughts that we don't realize we're not the voice in the head. We're the one who hears it. This is where certain practices become incredibly helpful. Not because they're trendy, but because they train us to relate to our thoughts in a new way. Practices like mindfulness, for example, simply sitting, breathing, and observing without judgment. Not trying to control the thoughts or push them away, but learning to let them come and go, like clouds passing through the sky. Another powerful tool is journaling. Not the kind where you write a perfect diary entry, but the raw kind, where you just spill your thoughts onto the page. Often, the act of writing them down helps create distance. You start to see patterns. You start to notice which thoughts are driven by fear, which ones are echoes of someone else's voice, and which ones, if any, are worth listening to. And then there's breath work. Even something as simple as pausing to take 3 slow, deep breaths. This sounds basic, but it can interrupt the mental noise and bring you back into your body, into this moment. Because the breath is always happening now. It's not in the past or the future. It's here. What's important is that these practices don't eliminate your thoughts. They help you remember that you are not your thoughts. And when you can remember that, when you can watch the mind without being pulled into every worry or judgment it throws at you, you start to find something deeper, a quiet space beneath the noise, a kind of inner stillness. And it's from that stillness that clarity, creativity, and genuine self-awareness begin to arise. You might even begin to notice how many of your thoughts are based on outdated fears, false assumptions, or automatic habits of judgment. You might realize that the mind often resists change, not because change is bad, but because the ego feels safer when things stay the same, even if the same isn't making you happy. So here's a gentle challenge for the next time you feel anxious, overwhelmed, or mentally cluttered. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to think your way out of it. Just pause, breathe, and observe. You'll be amazed at what begins to shift when you stop reacting and start witnessing. And maybe, just maybe, the next time your inner voice starts to spiral, you'll recognize it for what it is, a well-meaning narrator, but not the whole story. The liberating power of letting go. Let's pause for a moment and imagine something. Imagine you're walking through life carrying a heavy backpack. You've been carrying it for so long that you've stopped noticing the weight. But it's always there. Every step takes more effort than it needs to. And inside that backpack, it's not food or tools or anything useful. It's full of old fears, outdated stories, impossible expectations, and beliefs about who you're supposed to be. Some of it isn't even yours. It was handed to you by your culture, your family, your past. Now imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to stop walking and take that backpack off. This is what we're talking about today. The liberating power of letting go. Because once we begin to see the mental and emotional patterns we've been holding on to, the identities, the internal narratives, the habits of control, we have a choice. We can continue clinging to them out of fear or familiarity, or we can begin to release them. And when we do, what we often find is space. Not emptiness, not nothingness, but space for something new to grow. Letting go is not weakness. In fact, it often requires more strength, more courage than holding on. And it's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, quiet, invisible to others. It might look like letting go of control in a situation you can't manage, or releasing expectations about how life should look by now. It might mean dropping the need to prove yourself, to constantly appear strong, smart, attractive, successful, whatever image you've been trying to maintain. When we stop clinging to those things, something shifts inside. Energy that was trapped in anxiety or overthinking begins to move freely again. Mental clutter clears, emotional baggage lightens, and suddenly, we can breathe more deeply, not just physically, but psychologically. Now, I want to share something personal with you. A few years ago, I went through a period where everything I had built, professionally, emotionally, started to fall apart. On paper, everything looked stable. But inside, I was exhausted. I was chasing success, trying to meet everyone's expectations, constantly checking boxes but never actually feeling fulfilled. I had reached a point where even small tasks felt overwhelming, and I knew something had to change. But change didn't come in the form of a big decision. It came through surrender. I stopped trying to control the outcome. I stopped pretending that I had all the answers. And perhaps, most importantly, I let go of the image of the person I thought I had to be, the one who always had it together, who never asked for help, who couldn't afford to slow down. That surrender didn't lead to collapse. It led to clarity. And from that clarity came a new kind of energy, one that didn't come from pressure or perfectionism, but from alignment. Here's what I've learned. You can't grow if you're clinging. Growth needs space. It needs oxygen. And when you're holding tightly to certainty, to control, to an old version of yourself, there's no room for transformation. That's why letting go can feel like such a relief, even when it's scary. Because what you're actually releasing isn't your power. It's the illusion that you ever needed to force things to be okay. Think about how much time we spend trying to manage things that are outside our control. Other people's opinions, the future, the past. Or how often we stay in situations, jobs or relationships simply because we're afraid of the unknown. We cling to what's familiar, even when it's no longer working, because at least it's predictable. But what we often forget is that holding on is a choice, and so is letting go. So I want to ask you, and really sit with this. What are you holding on to that's no longer helping you grow? It could be a belief about your limitations, a story about your past, a version of yourself you no longer identify with. Or maybe it's something less obvious, the need to always be right, the pressure to be liked, the fear of disappointing people. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop carrying what isn't yours, or what no longer fits who you're becoming. And yes, there may be discomfort. The ego doesn't like uncertainty. But beyond the discomfort, there is lightness. There is movement. There is freedom. This is why dying before you die is such a powerful invitation. It's not about ending your life. It's about ending the patterns, the stories, the attachments that prevent you from truly living. From showing up as your whole self, not the self you perform, but the self you return to when the noise quiets and the masks come off. So as we move forward, I invite you to start noticing what you've been carrying out of habit, out of fear, out of obligation. And then ask yourself, what might open up for me if I gently put this down? Not everything you carry is yours to keep. Some things were meant to be lessons, not life sentences. Rebirth. Who are you without the mask? So here we are. We've talked about identity, ego, internal noise, and the courage it takes to let go of what no longer serves us. And now we arrive at the other side of that process. The part that isn't about loss, but about emergence. A kind of quiet rebirth. But let's be clear. This isn't about becoming someone else. It's not about reinventing yourself in a dramatic external way. This isn't a makeover. It's about uncovering what's always been there, beneath the surface. A truer self, a quieter self, one that doesn't need to perform or protect or prove anything. A self that has been waiting patiently for you to slow down long enough to hear it. Let's bring in a metaphor here, one that might help this feel more tangible. Think of a seed, a small, unremarkable-looking seed. From the outside, it gives no clue of what it might become. But deep inside, something is alive. Now, before that seed can become a plant, before it can grow roots or reach toward the sun, it has to break open. And from the seed's perspective, that moment must feel like destruction. The protective shell cracks. The old shape dissolves. The comfort of containment disappears. But only because something new is about to emerge. And that's what this inner transformation is like. The death we've been talking about, the dying before you die, is really just the seed cracking open. It can feel confusing, vulnerable, even scary. But it's not the end. It's the beginning. And what comes next is growth. Not growth toward something fake or imposed, but growth into who you actually are, when you stop trying to be what the world told you to be. This is the moment of rebirth. And not in a dramatic, movie-like way, but in quiet, consistent choices. You begin to move through the world with less resistance. You start to notice what actually feels aligned, instead of just following old habits or inherited expectations. You listen more closely to your own intuition. You reconnect with what gives you energy, rather than just what gives you approval. And that's an important distinction, because the world often rewards performance. It likes masks. It claps for success, not necessarily for authenticity. But something remarkable happens when you stop chasing external applause and begin listening for internal resonance. You become more you. Not a version of yourself designed to fit in or stand out, but a version that feels grounded, honest, and deeply alive. Words like resilience, authenticity, transformation, they can sound like big ideas, but at their core, they're all connected to this process. Resilience isn't just about pushing through hard times. It's about trusting that something stronger can grow from what has been broken down. Authenticity doesn't mean saying everything you think. It means living in a way that reflects your inner truth. And transformation? It's not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more fully yourself. Sometimes people ask, but if I let go of everything I've built, the habits, the roles, the identity, won't I disappear? And I understand that fear. But here's the truth. When you take off the mask, you don't disappear. You become visible, perhaps for the first time. You stop being who you were told to be, and you start being who you already are, underneath all the conditioning. This is the gift on the other side of dying before you die. It's not a disappearance. It's a return to yourself. A self that's softer, but not weaker. A self that's open, but not naive. A self that's no longer carrying the pressure to always be achieving, or pleasing, or performing. Instead, you become someone who simply is. And from that place, life becomes less of a struggle, and more of a conversation. So let me ask you this. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when you're not performing, not proving, not protecting? If that question feels difficult to answer, that's okay. You don't need to figure it out all at once. This is not about fixing yourself. It's about meeting yourself, slowly, gently, with curiosity. And sometimes, the most honest way to meet yourself is in silence, in nature, in creativity, in moments where nothing is expected of you, and you can simply exist. And you know what's beautiful? The people who are meant for you, the ones who truly resonate with your energy, will be drawn to that version of you. Not the version with the perfect resume, or the perfect smile, or the perfect answers, but the one who is real, and open, and present. So yes, the inner death can be uncomfortable, but the rebirth that follows is worth it. Because you're not becoming someone else. You're becoming someone real, someone whole, someone alive in ways you didn't even realize you had been missing. In daily life, micro-deaths and micro-rebirths. Now, if you're wondering how all of this, the inner dying and rebirth, actually plays out in your day-to-day life, you're not alone. Because, after all, transformation doesn't happen only in big, dramatic moments. It's often the small things, the tiny, sometimes invisible shifts, that add up to real change. I like to think of these as micro-deaths and micro-rebirths. They're small moments where we pause, let go, and step into something new, without even necessarily noticing at first. And over time, those moments shape how we show up in the world. Let me give you a few examples, because these are things we all face, all the time. Maybe it's saying no to a request that drains you, even when you feel guilty. It's a little death of the old habit where you said yes to please everyone, even at your own expense. Saying no is a tiny surrender, a letting go of the need to be all things to all people. But it's also a rebirth, the start of setting boundaries, of honoring your own needs and energy. Or maybe it's changing a habit that no longer serves you. That could be as simple as deciding to take a different route home from work to clear your mind, or as challenging as giving up a way of thinking that keeps you stuck. Each time you interrupt an automatic pattern, pause and choose differently, you're practicing this inner death and rebirth. Another one is apologizing sincerely when you've made a mistake. It can feel like dying to your pride, to your image of always being right or perfect. But that death opens up a rebirth of humility, connection, and real growth. It's hard, but freeing. The death here isn't literal, of course. It's about letting go of impulses, of the need to always be right, or the compulsion to control how things go. It's about slowing down enough to check in with yourself and ask, am I reacting out of habit, or acting with intention? And that question, how much of your behavior is driven by conscious intention, and how much by habit, is really powerful. Because most of us move through life without really noticing how often we operate on autopilot. We respond to situations the way we always have, simply because it's familiar. But when you start to pause, even just for a moment, you give yourself the chance to choose differently, to move through discomfort instead of running from it. And that's where growth happens. Growth isn't comfortable. It often feels awkward, vulnerable, even painful. But those micro-deaths, letting go of a knee-jerk reaction, dropping a limiting belief, stepping out of a comfort zone, they open the door for micro-rebirths. Moments when you show up as a slightly different, more authentic version of yourself. Think about the last time you did something like this. Maybe you stopped yourself from snapping in frustration, and instead took a deep breath. Or you asked for help instead of struggling alone. Those small moments might have seemed insignificant, but they're the building blocks of transformation. And here's the beautiful thing. You don't have to wait for a big crisis to start this process. You can begin right now, right here. You can start by checking in with yourself, maybe once or twice a day, and noticing, what am I holding on to? What can I let go of? How can I show up a little more fully? Because life is made of these small moments. And when you practice dying and rebirthing daily, you create a rhythm, a dance, that helps you move through life with more ease and authenticity. So as we continue exploring this idea, I invite you to notice your own micro-deaths and micro-rebirths, to catch yourself when you're on autopilot, and gently steer back to intention, to embrace the discomfort of change as a sign you're growing, not failing, and most importantly, to remember that this process is ongoing. There's no final destination. It's a lifelong journey of showing up, imperfectly, beautifully, and authentically, every single day. Cultural mirrors, stories of transformation. As we've been exploring this idea of dying before you die, it's worth stepping back for a moment and looking at how this theme appears in stories and wisdom from different cultures and traditions. Because what's striking is how many times, across time and place, people have recognized the same truth. Transformation requires a kind of death. Not a physical death, but an inner letting go, a shedding of old skins before something new can emerge. On the one hand, take the poetry of Rumi, the 13th century Persian mystic and Sufi master. His poems are filled with images of spiritual death and rebirth, of the soul dissolving into the beloved, of burning away the ego's illusions to reveal the light beneath. For Rumi, dying before you die is an invitation to transcend the small self, to experience a deep connection with the divine, and to live fully in the present moment. He writes about losing oneself completely. But paradoxically, this loss is what makes true life possible. On the other hand, we can look to Joseph Campbell's famous concept of the hero's journey. This framework has shaped countless stories in literature and film, from ancient myths to modern blockbusters. What's striking about Campbell's model is that the hero's transformation often involves a symbolic death, a descent into darkness or the underworld, before they can return changed, stronger, and wiser. This descent is essential. It's a moment of surrender, of facing fears, of letting go of old identities. Without it, the hero's journey is incomplete. Buddhist philosophy offers another perspective that resonates deeply with our theme. The concept of non-attachment encourages us to recognize that clinging to people, possessions, or ideas causes suffering. To be free, truly free, we must practice letting go, even of things we think define us. This release isn't a loss, but a gain. A liberation from the mental chains that limit our peace and happiness. In Buddhism, this process of letting go and emerging anew is ongoing. A daily practice of dying to fixed views and rebirthing openness and compassion. And to bring this idea closer to our modern lives, consider stories from film or literature that explore transformation through loss and renewal. One example might be the character arc in movies like Inside Out, where the protagonist learns to accept the complexity of emotions and let go of simplistic ideas about happiness. Or novels where characters undergo deep personal shifts, shedding old roles, beliefs, or fears, to find a truer sense of self. All these stories, ancient and modern, spiritual and secular, echo the same core truth. To become who we really are, something has to end. Something inside must die, so something else can live. So, I want to invite you to reflect on a question. What story have you been telling yourself about who you have to be? Is it the story of the perfect achiever, the loyal friend, the strong provider, or maybe the person who never makes mistakes? And where did that story come from? Is it really yours? Or is it a script handed down by family, culture, or past experiences? When we begin to notice these stories, we create space to question them, to ask, do these stories still serve me? Do they reflect my truth? Or just someone else's expectations? And then, perhaps, we can begin to write new stories, stories that are freer, truer, and more alive. Because transformation isn't just about changing how we act. It's about changing the narrative we live by. And when that narrative shifts, everything else can shift too. In this way, dying before you die becomes not just a personal journey, but a shared human experience. A thread connecting us across time and culture, reminding us that to truly live, we must first be willing to let go. As we bring this episode to a close, I want to leave you with a thought. One that has gently guided so many seekers, thinkers, and ordinary people alike through their own journeys of transformation. The phrase, "to die before you die," isn't about giving up. Far from it. It's about waking up. Imagine, for a moment, that the ego, that complex, noisy part of us that clings, protects, and performs, isn't something to be eradicated or feared. Instead, releasing the ego is more like expanding your sense of who you are. It's opening a door to a wider, richer experience of life. You're not losing yourself, you're becoming more yourself. This shift is subtle, yet profound. Like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, you don't vanish when the old self falls away. You transform. You spread new wings. So here's a question to hold gently in your mind. What would shift if you truly believed that nothing essential can ever be lost? Nothing you deeply are, your core, your true self, your essential being, can ever be taken away. It's always there, waiting beneath the surface, beneath the stories, fears, and habits. When we live with that trust, the fear of loss, the fear of change, begins to soften. We learn to meet discomfort not as a threat, but as a doorway. We realize that every ending contains a beginning. Every death contains a life. You don't have to have all the answers right now. The journey inward is ongoing, sometimes winding, sometimes smooth. And that's perfectly okay. Curiosity and kindness toward yourself will carry you far. As you move forward from this moment, I encourage you to keep asking yourself those gentle questions. When was the last time you truly listened to your inner voice? How much of your life are you living intentionally? What small death can you embrace today to invite rebirth tomorrow? Transformation is not a one-time event. It's a daily practice. It's in the little choices, the quiet moments, the willingness to let go and show up again. So, if this episode has touched something inside you, I invite you to share it with someone who might benefit. Talk about it. Journal about it. Sit with it in silence. Make it part of your ongoing conversation with yourself. Because in the end, to die before you die is to live, truly, fully, and deeply alive. Thank you for being here with me on Code Your English. Until next time, keep exploring, keep growing, and keep coding your own story in English. One word, one breath, one moment at a time.